Hello. As some of you might be aware, last weekend was the UK International Roguelike Development Conference. Traditionally, IRDC has floated around from country to country from one year to the next, and I think it has almost always, if not entirely always, been in Europe. This year is, as far as I know, the first year when there's been sufficient interest both in the United States and in Europe to actually have two sort of branching events, a bit like PAX and PAX East. So we've had an American IRDC and a European IRDC. The European one was held in Nottingham, which happens also to be the town of my birth. So there was a dual interest in me attending. So I toddled along to IRDC last weekend, and I had considered going in a previous year. I think last year it was in Berlin, and I gave serious thought to flying over to Berlin in order to attend. But I was a bit daunted. I wasn't that familiar with the roguelike community at that point. I wasn't that actively involved in it, and I wasn't sure what I could offer to any sort of conversation with people who actually develop games. I'd never developed a game before, and I thought I would be kind of an outsider in terms of attending a development conference as someone who's not involved in development. This year, I felt a little more comfortable with that, because I've become more actively involved in the community, and also I've had a couple of appearances on Roguelike Radio, so I've sort of actually taken up some kind of position where I've been called upon to express my opinion on roguelikes, so I feel a little less intimidated than I once did about doing so in the company of developers. And also I have actually collaborated on developing a small game now, so I do have some limited experience of actually working on a game, so I felt a bit more comfortable about attending a development conference this year than I did previously. I did opt not to put my name down to speak, which is something a couple of people asked me about once I was there. In retrospect, knowing how welcoming the community actually is, and how accepting the people there were, I could have given a presentation of my own there. I think it would have worked, and actually now I can think of a couple of topics I could have given it on, so maybe next year I will actually give a presentation at IRDC. This year I thought, I still don't know if I have enough to say to game developers to actually get up and talk to them from a stage about it. So I opted to just attend as a spectator. Like any conference, IRDC is kind of in two parts, or two aspects. One is the conference itself, people giving presentations and such. The other is the kind of social side of it, the mixing with people with similar interests, and both of those were very rewarding in their own right. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my experiences of attending IRDC and what I thought some of the highlights were. In the background here, because I'm just recording an audio track, I'll probably put up maybe gameplay footage from games developed by people who were there. That would seem to make sense. I might also throw in some of the photos which were taken during the weekend. A lot of the best photos were taken by Maj'eyal, the developer of Keeper RL. He has said anyone is free to use them if they like, as long as the people who are in the photos are happy with it. So I will probably throw in a couple of photos, just so you can see us all having a fun and occasionally hilarious time at this conference. So the conference itself was across 2 days, the Saturday and Sunday of the weekend, although in practice it ended up being kind of 3-ish days, because some of us got there early on Friday evening and met up at the pub, the Bell Inn in Nottingham city centre, which is one of the oldest pubs in the city, and then we progressed to Darren's hotel room, where we intended to play some board games, but in fact just talked about roguelikes a lot. And there was a fairly useful discussion there, which I could weigh in on, about the usefulness of YouTube audiences and Let's Players and that sort of thing in the promotion and community development of your game, and whether your games should be to some extent, or whether it's a good idea to some extent, cater your games to being played on YouTube. That is a thing that's becoming more of a question now, more of a concern for people to actually think about. And certainly there are some games out there that seem to have been designed specifically for play on YouTube. So there was a discussion there, and that's probably the kind of thing I would have given a talk on had I decided to give one. But that was Friday, and then on Saturday, the event itself kicked off in earnest. And it was basically a day of presentations. That was sort of the conference proper. But all of the pre-conference emails and posts and that kind of thing referred to it as an unconference. That is kind of a more casual, more informal version of the conference format. So it wasn't as formal as an academic conference, but still followed the same sort of structure. And one of the strongest things about this actual conference day full of presentations was how varied they were. Not just the topics, but the people who were speaking. So the topics covered all kinds of areas, from developing an AI to beat games like Spelunky in place of a player, through procedural level generation, through the use of real-world architectural principles in game architecture, and all kinds of things, all kinds of topics. The ones that appealed to me the most, as someone who isn't a programmer of any sort and has no programming knowledge, were the ones more about the way you realise game worlds and that kind of thing. I found all of the talks interesting, but some of them were easier for me to grasp when they had a bit less of the technical programming content. So things like the presentation given by Tom Betts on procedural world generation, for instance. Tom Betts is one of the main designers / developers behind the first-person stealth survival-ish game, Sir, You Are Being Hunted. And the areas in Sir, You Are Being Hunted are kind of islands modelled after the English countryside, with sort of small villages and that kind of thing scattered around. And Tom gave a very interesting presentation on the way you can design your procedural generation and sort of layer it, so that features you definitely want to appear in there somewhere appear, and the way that some features take priority over others, and also the way you can divide your open world area into cells, which then sort of have blurred edges, so there isn't just a clear dividing line between, for instance, fields and a forest, and they sort of blur together a bit. There was a lot to it, and I understand that the plan is to get most, if not all, of these presentations up on YouTube at some point. So they're all worth checking out. That was one of my favourites. And there was a lot of content in it, but that was the gist. The way that you can make a procedurally generated open world space feel like a reasonably convincing, realistic-ish open world space. But the way that you balance not only generating the world in a way that seems like the real world might generate, but also in a way that includes gameplay-friendly features. So sometimes realism has to take a backseat to things that make sense for designing the gameplay. And just Tom's thoughts on that and the way he layered procedural generation and sort of tiered it, that was all very interesting to me. But there was all kinds of other stuff. Darren Gray, the legendary Darren Gray, talked about making death in roguelikes more interesting, more easy to identify in the sense of not dying in the game and then wondering how you got killed or feeling like you were just shafted by the random number generator, but actually being able to look back on your play and go, that's what I did wrong that caused me to die there. And handling death in more interesting ways than whittling down HP as a number. So that was another highlight. And there were all kinds of things here. And speakers from all kinds of backgrounds too, ranging from people who've actually released commercially available games on services like Steam. So we had Johannes Christman, who's one of the developers behind The Curious Expedition, and we had Nicola Casalini, aka Dark God, the main developer behind Tome 4. Well, really the sole developer, although I gather he's pulled in a few more people now. So ranging from people like that who've actually commercially released games, through to, for instance, one speaker who is a university student, computer science, I think, who gave a presentation on his dissertation, which is developing a procedural level generation system. And it was very useful and informative to have not only a range of topics, but a range of directions that people were approaching this from, with various levels of experience in designing games. And that was one of the real strong points of the conference day itself, that it wasn't just a selection of people who were all at a similar sort of stage in game development careers and whatnot, but are covering the whole spectrum from full-time professional game developers through hobbyists through to students. That was really interesting, and there wasn't a duff presentation among them. They were all strong, and they were all interesting. Now, the other aspect of it was the social side. I mean, there was a bit more to the conference itself. We had a second day, which was a roguelike exhibition. The event was held at the National Video Game Arcade in Nottingham, which seems to be a kind of part arcade, part exhibition centre kind of thing, which was really nice to see, considering that until relatively recently, video games have been kind of a niche hobby which was a bit frowned upon in a lot of the mainstream. To see a dedicated centre for not just games but sort of game culture was just really nice to see. And the staff there were great. They were really helpful. They didn't make any money off us. We didn't pay them for use of their facilities. They just welcomed us, and the only thing they got out of it was that we were also putting on this roguelike exhibition on the second day. And we learnt a lot, I think, all of us, from that exhibition. But you'll hear that discussed a bit more on the episode of Roguelike Radio, which we recorded while we were there. So the other aspect, apart from the main conference itself, was the social side. I mentioned that there was a lot of discussion and conversation on the Friday night amongst those of us who were there. We went for dinner every day. We went to the pub a couple of times, including the old Trip to Jerusalem, which is a pub set into a cave network underneath Nottingham Castle, and it has flails and axes and things mounted on the walls. It seemed thematically appropriate, so I managed to coax people into going there. And I'll put up a photo somewhere in the video around this point of those of us who were at that pub. So there was this whole social aspect as well, which comes with any conference, really. I went to a couple of history conferences when I was a student, including Grigonog Medieval Colloquium while I was doing my Masters. And I loved just sort of the meeting of minds aspect with other people who have knowledge and expertise in a field you're interested in. And the same kind of thing happened here. I mean, it wasn't all talking shop. There was chat about various things, conversations over a wide range of topics, but there was also, as you would expect, a lot of roguelike conversation. I mean, one of the highlights of the conversation for me was witnessing a firm discussion between Aaron Steed, the developer of Red Rogue, and Pete Hurst, one of the dev team for Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup, about whether it's possible to reverse engineer an interesting Sokoban puzzle that's procedurally generated, and whether we should try to illustrate the concept on the table using beer mats. Aaron, as I recall, seemed to be very much of the opinion that you couldn't reverse engineer a Sokoban puzzle in a way which would be interesting, and Pete and I more or less disagreed with him. So if you think you can reverse engineer a procedurally generated Sokoban puzzle which is interesting and fun to play, by all means prove one of us wrong, or indeed try it and fail and prove the other of us wrong. So there's a challenge for you, gentle viewers. But that kind of discussion was really interesting, and we covered all kinds of stuff in the conversation as well as in the conference itself. We covered things like the merits of early access, how you engage with your players and fostering a community, and just all kinds of things. So it was a really, really interesting social aspect to the conference. Although, on a purely emotional, sentimental side, perhaps my favourite part was the fact that I came away from this, at the end, feeling much more at ease and friendly with all these people, many of whom I had heard of. That a lot of them were names I knew, and even people I'd interacted with to some extent on things like Twitter and Reddit. But now they're people to me, because I spent 2 days in their company. And that just really feels like it's brought the community more together for me. It sort of realised the community and made it tangible. So there's sort of a warmth and familiarity to it which wasn't there before. A few of the highlights really came out of this social side. Things like trying to explain to Johannes the concept of mushy peas. He came over from Germany, specially for IRDC. I met up with him and a couple of others on the Friday night, and we had some fish and chips, and he was offered mushy peas, trying to explain to someone who's never come across mushy peas that it is just kind of mush made of peas and some other stuff, and it has chunks of pea floating in it, was pretty tricky, but I think he enjoyed them in the end. Also things like the growing determination of Mark Johnson, who organised the conference this year, his determination, which grew and grew throughout Sunday, to actually defeat Darren Gray at the penguin-based fish collecting board game, Hey, That's My Fish. That was entertaining to witness. There was a lot of board game playing amongst some of us on the Sunday. Darren, I think, won every game of Hey, That's My Fish. But with every defeat, Mark just became more and more determined to win once. But I don't think he ever did. Similarly, Darren hilariously pulled the wool over my eyes in the Resistance. I started off... I'm not going to explain how the Resistance works, but there are players who are secretly spies, and you don't know who they are. And throughout the first sort of half of the game, I was very, very suspicious of Darren, but he managed to turn it around until by the end of the game, he was the one person I trusted, and he was in fact a spy. So a masterful performance by both Darren and Mark, who were the two spies in our game. And it was that, not just the interesting, useful, informative presentations on the Saturday, and the learning experience of trying to put on the exhibition on the Sunday, but also just that social engagement with all these people who share an interest with me. That really was the highlight for me. So anyway, I would recommend attending the International Roguelike Development Conference to anyone who has even a passing interest in roguelikes and their creation and design, and what makes them enjoyable to play, and the ways they can be improved and modernised. You don't need to be a developer. You don't need to have designed a game. If you just have any sort of interest in roguelikes or anything tangentially related, procedural generation systems, anything like that, then IRDC is a worthwhile experience, and the community is very welcoming. It doesn't matter if you're a roguelike veteran of 20 years or whether you've only just discovered procedurally generated games in the last 6 months. Everyone will welcome you with open arms, and don't worry, as I did, about feeling like you don't have anything to offer to the game development community. If you feel you have something to say, even if it's just sharing your experiences of getting into procedural generation design for the first time, then feel free to volunteer to speak, because I can assure you that the community will be welcoming. So yes, I highly recommend IRDC. I will be going again next year if it's at all possible for me. And you never know, I may actually volunteer to speak next year. We'll see. Now, on a non-IRDC note, I've been very quiet on the video front lately. Real life has been kicking my ass a little bit. As you may have noticed, I don't put adverts on my videos, so I don't make any revenue from them. I believe in sparing you good viewers the plague of adverts. So I do have to maintain a day job. And the day job has been very, very hectic the last few weeks. But I'm starting to wrangle some free time back off the job, so hopefully I'll be able to get back into more regular video recording soon. So expect Barony coming up very shortly, and some other things as well. I already have plans for a couple of videos coming up. So anyway, as always, thanks for watching, and keep your eyes peeled for more Indie Ocean coming very soon. Also, there'll be the episode of Roguelike Radio, which we recorded at IRDC, coming up any time now, as far as I know. So, thanks for watching, and until the next time, bye for now.